we have sustainable mining coming up with Don Bubar, who is the president and CEO of Avalon Advanced Materials. Don's a geologist with 40 years of experience in mineral exploration and development in Canada, and he's focused on bringing sustainability to the mining industry. Great to see you again, Don, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Good to be back for my second Wall Street Creek Summit and talk on this theme again. And also want to speak briefly on the relevance of critical mineral supply chains and clean technology, because that's become a main focus of our business now, because of that's how you're going to create sustainability, is by innovating new ways to extract minerals of interest in sustainable ways to create those technologies needed for that future sustainable economy that everybody wants to see. And so a bit more background on Avalon is we have actually been looking at opportunities with non-traditional commodities, now commonly referred to as critical minerals, going back 25 years. I started this company 26 years ago and got into lithium the year after, cesium tantalum. But maybe I was a bit early then in trying to start these supply chains, but I'm patient, and it looks like our time has come, as there's now general recognition of the importance of many of these obscure, relatively unknown commodities in new clean technologies. And one of the events that really helped get this message out was this event put on by the World Bank, Minerals for Climate Action, on how none of those renewable energy technologies will ever happen unless we have the resources that can provide the critical materials and produce them in sustainable ways. But we can do it. But it's challenging because it is a very different business from traditional mining. And I actually don't really like to use the word mining to describe our business because it confuses people in terms of what you're trying to do. Traditional mining has always been based on well-known exchange-traded commodities, where the principle was high grade and large tonnage in order to build the operation at a large scale and keep your unit operating costs as low as possible, knowing that you had an unlimited market for these materials. But for these emerging non-traditional commodities, you don't have that. And in many cases, you have to basically innovate ways to recover them efficiently and turn them into the derivative products that the market wants, and prove that you can do that before you can really know that you've got an economic development opportunity. So that's very different, and it means it's all about creating a demand pull versus supply push, which was the principle of the traditional mining industry. But starting to get figured out, and actually one of the reasons China now has control of a lot of these critical mineral supply chains is they recognized this a long time ago and started building the processing capacity, and not necessarily having the resources to feed them, but creating the capacity so they could again go and attract that supply from other sources. So that's how they've been able to get control of a lot of these critical materials supply chains. And that's been the thing missing here that we now need to focus more on, is innovation and on supporting more of the demand locally to help new producers get started. So that's a message, that's a key message now for getting these whole supply chains started. And companies like us, the reason we call ourselves Avalon Advanced Materials is because we want to position companies like us as more like a technology play than a mining play. And more companies are starting to recognize that. One example is a junior company that I've been involved with in the past called Zen Graphene Solutions, who found a very unique graphite resource where the graphite occurs in such a way that it's relatively easy to turn it into graphene, that new wonder nanomaterial. But since then, their focus has not been on developing a mine, but on developing the technologies that can take advantage of graphene, and then they'll start to produce from the mine. And that's a principle that we want to see applied more and more in this industry going forward. The other thing I want to talk about was, as I talked about in the last Wall Street Green Summit, is this potential now for extracting value, particularly these non-traditional commodities, from historic mine wastes and from the waste streams of current operations. There's so many examples of closed mining operations that were developed for one traditional commodity in the past, where the resource may have contained a whole lot of other minerals that had no value or interest when they were developed, but do today. So those sites need to be looked at now as opportunities to go back to them and, using new, more progressive recovery technologies, recover these other minerals of interest in environmentally sustainable ways and clean up the long-term environmental liabilities while you do it. So this is an opportunity for the mining industry now to become part of the whole circular economy that I heard a speaker talking about this morning, and start to extract more value from the rock that comes out of the ground, so there's not gigantic waste piles left behind as long-term legacy asset issues with those closed mine sites. So there's actually, I've been looking at this for quite a long time now, and there's actually starting to be more and more interest in the space, even from some of the major companies that have not really looked at it in the past. And one recent example is Rio Tinto, who now have been talking about the concept of full value mining as part of the principles they want to apply going forward, and looking at what else they can recover value from existing tailing streams, and starting to look at closed mine sites they have as opportunities to go back and look at recovering some of these non-traditional commodities that are in the waste. So that's a good sign for us that this is going to catch on, and hopefully we can get the regulators in government now to start to see these closed mine sites as opportunities and not just no-go zones as perpetual liabilities, which has often been how they've been looked at in the past. Just afraid to do anything there, instead of looking at them as really interesting economic development opportunities consistent with the whole principle of sustainability and creating this new clean economy going forward. So I'm pleased to be able to provide some leadership on that. And it's partly about innovation on extraction technologies. We've been looking at a past producing tin mine that has all sorts of elements of interest associated with the tin, including lithium, and how we can recover tin from the waste using technologies like sensor-based ore sorting that involve just using sensors and after crushing the rock to pick out the minerals of interest, and no water, no chemical reagents. So very little environmental impacts associated with creating the mineral log concentrates. That's just one example of many out there that are being looked at now, including recovering rare earths from historic mine waste. And there's lots of those situations. They're getting looked at in the US now from historic coal mines. Lots of examples where there's rare earths of significant concentrations in the waste and in the acid mine drainage that can be looked at as opportunities now. And we're looking at other ones, one in Canada where there's phosphate resource with significant rare earths in the historic mine waste there. So many good examples out there, and more that can be looked at going forward if we start to look at these as opportunities for the circular economy and sustainable mining. And last thing I'll mention briefly is, Alan's going to speak to this as well, as how with ESG in Canada now, we're now calling it ESGI, with the I standing for Indigenous. And it's all about now trying to take advantage of some of these new opportunities in mineral development and critical materials to facilitate greater participation by Indigenous business in creating these new critical material supply chains. It is a huge opportunity. Many companies are now starting to get that, to provide the support. They have greater access to capital, and that could help a lot of the small northern communities out of the poverty trap. So I'll let Alan elaborate on that as another opportunity, and that's one of the things that we're trying to publicize, as well as emphasizing how these critical materials need to be produced in environmentally, socially responsible ways. And we have been trying to do that for 10 years now, because recognized there was no point in trying to produce materials for clean technology in unclean ways, and have embraced ESG principles and recently secured an ESG risk rating after an audit by Sustainalytics Morningstar. And we're hopeful that's going to inspire more companies in the mineral business to do the same thing. So maybe I'll leave it there. I think I've hit my 10 minutes.
Well, Don, a couple of things, if you could give a little bit more insight, and I think you brought up a great point of, you brought up critical minerals, rare earths, some of those things, but you also brought up mine waste. And so and for Avalon, is Avalon, and you said, you don't like the term mining necessarily. So the technologies that you're deploying, you mentioned Rio Tinto looking at a whole systemic solution. So would some of Avalon's technologies come into play in their existing mining versus you look almost exclusively at here's an old coal mine, an old copper mine, what have you, that we can find the value essentially in the tailings waste, what have you. A little bit more through on the Avalon process there, so we can all understand it, because most of what we know broadly, if you're not worked in mining, is kind of related to all of a sudden there's an orange river in the American Southwest, or mine tailings, and how they're depending on what's been extracted, a dust issue or a dust challenge or things like that. So obviously that's an area that needs cleanup in general. And you're saying that it's not just a waste problem, it's another resource through Avalon's technologies.
And a lot of other technologies that are being innovated now, which is great to see, because historically, most major mining operations, once they got established to produce one traditional commodity, and they had invested a lot of capital in getting it built and a big plant to process it, there was very little incentive there for them to change anything. As long as it was making good money, there was no real incentive to invest in looking at more efficient ways to do that, or implementing new technologies.
So similar to other, for when you think about extractive technology, similar for, if I've got an oil well, I'm going to flare gas and not worry about it because I don't want to build out the gas infrastructure. Same, whether it's a commodity that has value, it doesn't have value to them relative to their focus, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, actually. Yep.
There was, and I think this kind of plays on the one question from the audience, but you brought up sustainable mining and ESG investment. So I guess, how can that benefit perhaps small mining companies? If you're not a mining company, if you're a technology provider to some of these larger things, what are some of the financing or capital solutions, or what are obstacles to getting technologies like yours to the Rio Tintos, or to some of these, to reclaiming some of these mines? You mentioned if it's been shut down and it's already designated, that might be a regulatory issue. So it sounds like on one hand, for going after existing markets, it's almost the regulatory side versus, so that might be one side, but the other might be what's there for getting Avalon or some of these other technologies you mentioned to be used by the Rio Tintos of the world.
Well, one of the challenges that as a small cap publicly traded company you're facing in this business is that the tradition has been to focus on one specific commodity and become kind of a commodity price speculation vehicle to attract investor interest. And that did work in the past for traditional commodities where there's high visibility on the price of gold and copper, et cetera.
Mhm.
But for these non-traditional commodities, no, there isn't. There is no posted pricing on many of them. So you have to, it's not as easy for investors at the early stage to see what the value proposition is to give you access to capital you need to start to get it developed. But that's where I think the ESG can be helpful because of the interest now in the ESG investment community, investing in responsible production of materials, that could be an additional source of capital for entrepreneurial companies trying to innovate these new supply chains with these non-traditional materials and do it in sustainable ways.
And so we have a few questions, it looks like, coming through the chat, but I would, again, request the audience to send them to Q&A. But that actually, some of those questions did prompt me to ask something I was going on. We only have a few minutes left, but you brought up again if it's going to be clean technologies, and one of the things I think investors for clean tech or climate tech have talked about a long time is patient capital. And if you said you've been working on this for 25 years, I think that's about as patient as we can get in some of these industries. But one of the challenges, and I think you mentioned a lot of the newer technologies for climate tech, clean tech, solar panels, what have you, they need either rare earths or things that are, as you said, just not as common on the commodities or commonly traded. So are there some vehicles, or is this another way of targeting those technologies or those investment or those critical materials? You mentioned, I think you showed up a program from the UN. What are you working on there as far as where some progress that mining or things that need to happen to get those technologies or those commodities, those materials to suppliers? I mean, like you said, it's a more opaque and smaller market. So with the growth of those technologies, is there more capital coming your way, or more reporting, more standards, anything that you've seen on that front?
It's starting to be, although I think there's definitely a role for government in this to show visible support for creating these supply chains here in North America now, to send a clear signal to the capital markets that government wants these supply chains to happen, and that is perceived as a reduction of risk because we haven't been very good at it in the past. And so there's no real evidence that this is a good way to invest capital and trying to start these. And the other point I'd like to make is that education is important on this. Most people get very little education in these more obscure elements in the periodic table in terms of what they are and how they can be used. And we need to inspire more research and development in academia and the university level on how they can be used in innovative ways that can then be create that new demand for many of these obscure elements going forward. So I've been saying to the Canadian government, we've got them all on the ground. You want to leave them there, or should we use them to innovate some new technologies and business development opportunities for Canadians in the North?
So Don, we've hit our time slot, but one thing I do want to clarify before we move over to Stephen, there are rare earths or critical minerals, but they are, it's not that they're only certain deposits or something like that. It's that they're very diffuse, or it's a more difficult mining capacity, correct? It's not that there are no rare earths in Canada or North America. It's just, it hasn't been as concentrated or exploited the way it has in other parts. Is that an accurate statement?
No, it's not actually.
Okay.
Rare earth elements are a group of elements that actually occur very commonly in many different geological environments. is finding ways that they occur that facilitate ease of recovery.
Okay.
And this one with coal mine waste is a particularly interesting one, when they occur in the acid mine drainage. And I like to point out, Mother Nature's already done all the hard work for you by getting them into solution. Then it's just getting them out of solution, and there's some innovative ways to do that very efficiently.
All right, Don, thanks. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I did think that teed up well for our next speaker. Don, if you want to put your contact info in the chat, and I think some of our audience members have already been looking up Avalon, which I believe is publicly traded. So, pleasure to have you as always.